Awesome. Well, excited to welcome Arnab, the CEO of Xactly, to the stage here. Arnab has an incredible background with over 2 decades leading teams and 7 years driving the AI-powered revenue platform Xactly to incredible success. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, Ross, it is great to be here. Thank you for having me. This is a great event that you're putting on, and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Awesome. Well, as someone who's definitely focused on execution and building Xactly into what it is today, I thought you'd be a great person to come on and talk about, from a CEO's perspective, how do you build and maintain a culture of excellence? So maybe that's a good place to start. How do you think about, building and growing teams and cultures and setting the bar really high?
Yeah, it's a great question, and obviously, I think a lot goes into just generally delivering excellence and performance in a company, from org design to cross-functional collaboration to having clarity around your objectives. But I think the piece you hit on is really important, which is building a culture of excellence. And I think it's something that doesn't happen kind of overnight. It's something you have to continuously work at. And you'll feel like there are moments where you've got it, and then there are moments where you feel like you don't. That can all happen sort of in the same day or the same meeting.
Yeah.
But it's really in the organization ingraining a set of habits that allow the team to continuously deliver on expectations, allow them to meet the needs of the marketplace. And so the real question, I think, for a lot of leaders is, how do you ingrain these behaviors? Like, what do you, how do you ensure that your teams are going to live up to those ideas? And so I just delivered a few weeks ago kind of my annual CEO letter. And actually, coincidentally, I tried to articulate what those behaviors are. And so there's sort of three key principles that, I highlighted in this letter. One is, and I think Jeff Bezos has sort of made this term famous, this notion of engaging in truth-seeking behaviors, right? The reality is, like, we can only deliver excellence if we have an objective view of the world, which is based on accurate and unbiased information and understanding. And the important thing is facing those truths, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they might challenge our existing beliefs. And it really is about cultivating intellectual honesty and embracing sort of constructive criticism and staying curious and all of those things. And I think when it comes to salespeople, this is really important, because those principles are the ones that I think are the most helpful in being able to be objective about the status of deals and opportunities, and making sure that you're doing all the right things to get a deal to closure. You're being honest with yourself about, do I have alignment with the power in the deal? Do I have, a buyer's buying? Do I understand the timeline? Do I understand the purchasing process? And so constantly engaging in those questions, I think, is super important from a truth-seeking perspective. The second one is this notion of, and this is probably close near and dear to your heart, given what Report does, but it's really embracing, trends quickly with a bias for action, right? I think, the market changes quickly around us, and our ability to react to those changes is, frankly, the difference between success and failure. And that's true, for companies and their strategy, but it's also true for salespeople and deals and transactions that they're working with, right? And so making sure that we are constantly listening, constantly being curious, asking that, fifth level of why kind of question, collecting that information, and then taking action on it, and galvanizing people to take action around us is super critical. And so that's, I think, another, principle that we talk about a lot at Xactly. And then the third one is taking kind of a long-term perspective. I think it's really easy to get very focused on today and the transaction that's in front of us. And obviously, near-term results matter. We don't have business without them. But I think our belief is that a company's true measure of achievement is creating lasting impact, and being thoughtful about the decisions that we make, and really investing in, whether it's our products or enabling our people or the relationships that we have with partners and customers. That, in the end, is what's going to create an ongoing culture of excellence.
Yeah, compounding benefits for sure. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that is something that we talk a lot about from a salesperson perspective. It's, trading off that near-term thing you could potentially get from a customer versus the long-term sort of optimization of that customer relationship. And so really thinking about, in our case, most of our customers are with us for a decade or longer. And so we're really talking about long-term relationships and making sure we're doing right by our customers over the long term.
Totally. And one thing you started with there around building a culture of excellence are the habits and expectations, and that's one thing that I've kind of been obsessed around is
Mhm.
I think most cases where there's been frustration, internally or with customers or partners, has been misaligned expectation setting. I think that's kind of like the key to any great relationship in general, especially the business world. And would love to hear your perspective on how do you think about setting the right expectations at the CEO level at your company, right? Like how do you help fellow C-suite VPs, directors down to managers and ICs understand what great looks like
Yeah.
at your company? And then we can get into the next stage is how do we, what happens when they're doing it or not, but how do you think about that expectation setting at the CEO level?
Yeah, I mean, I would think about it in two ways. In kind of what I call modeling and then measurement, if you will. So I think one is leaders, you have to model these behaviors that you want, right? And you have to be very intentional about modeling it. And frankly, you need to be really intentional about when you yourself don't live up to
Mm,
expectations, and sort of like being able to sort of say, have the humility to say, yeah, I didn't hit the mark on that one, but I've learned from it. I'm committed to sort of doing better. And I think that frankly is modeling in and of itself as well. So that's sort of like one piece of it. Um, and the second piece of it is having the ability to measure what people are doing, right? I think everyone gets a perspective on how they think they're doing. And sometimes that perspective isn't fully aligned with the reality of the information and the data that of what they're doing. And so having an ability to capture that information and then having processes where you surface that data to allow people to see kind of what they're doing and to allow them to self-modulate what their perceptions are with maybe what the reality is of what's happening.
yeah. And that's something I think a lot of people have been reflecting on and maybe have gotten wrong, especially in the go-to-market world around measuring activity versus the quality, right? If we're talking about, hey, we want to deliver excellence, well, it's not a number of calls, it's not a number of emails, it's, you know, how much are we showing our customers or prospects or whoever that we care, that we give a shit. And curious to hear
Mhm.
how you think about measurement and the harder to quantify pieces. How do you share what great looks like? How do you share when you're doing that, when you're not doing that, and building a culture again around like the harder to inspect and measure pieces?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it is always it's much easier to measure the quantitative than it is the qualitative,
Yeah,
right? And I think, and because quantitative is easier to measure, that's what we tend to measure, to your point about.
exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, it's like, oh, we can look at all the stuff, but like, I think we could probably all agree that like that's maybe not the stuff that matters the most.
Yeah, yeah. And so the way that we think about it exactly is making sure that you're marrying the quantitative with actual qualitative feedback. And so we have a lot of mechanisms in our company across like someone's pre-sales experience, through their product experience, through their post-sale, service and support experience, where we're not only capturing and asking for data around what was your experience, at given a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 10, or an NPS score, whatever the case might be, but we're also asking for qualitative feedback, right? And making it as easy as possible, as frictionless as possible for users to provide that. And to be honest, I spend more time reading qualitative feedback than I do looking at numbers,
I
right?
think leaders in general, what I found is actually care about the quotes more than the figures, because I think everyone realizes that you can make numbers look a certain way
Yep.
and you can't change the sentiment of the feeling from a customer and employee with the
Yep.
quote.
And a lot gets lost in averages, right? There's that whole saying, like, my hair could be on fire and I could be sitting in a block of ice. On average, I'm fine, but clearly, I'm not fine, right? So I think it's that qualitative feedback that ends up providing you the context that you need to then look at the numbers and say, okay, here's kind of what these numbers are telling us and what it tells us we should be doing next.
Totally. Well, shifting gears a bit, and something I was excited to get your take on, because we're seeing this trend of markets getting. I mean, I feel like it's every 5 years we talk about this because that's kind of the trend. Markets getting more competitive, right? Great software development and design, a couple decades ago was rare, and I think it's becoming more common, both as the craft of building great technology and go-to-market teams kind of getting disseminated, but also obviously with technology and AI and SaaS development. I'm curious how you think about staying ahead of the curve and out competing folks with a company that's been around for a while with a great product and customers for 10 plus years.
Mhm.
How do you think about winning and staying successful in growing competitive markets?
Yeah, I mean, I think it, and it's going to sound cliche, but a lot of it has to do with customer centricity, right? It's like really making sure that you are listening to your customers and really understanding the challenges they face and what they need. And I think kind of like in the old days, when we think about like what defines a market leader, I think people would go to what is the size of the company, what is their market share, right? To look
Yeah.
at those objective metrics, and obviously like those are important, but I think what really defines market leaders today are companies that can adapt well, right? That are really nimble, that are agile, that are really understanding how the world is changing and adapting to those. And I think in a lot of cases, you can look at companies that frankly aren't the biggest by market share or revenue, but when you talk about an industry, they're the ones viewed as the market leaders, right? And I mean, in tech, which is the world we live in, like I would say Tesla's a good example of that. I would say Nvidia is a good example of that. Like I don't think people even know that these aren't the biggest companies in those spaces, but they're definitely viewed sort of as market leaders. And
Staying
so,
ahead of the curve, it sounds like, we talk about this in sales, like having a strong, point of view. The folks that have the
yeah,
point of view that are opinionated tend to kind of be recognized, especially in tech, as the market leaders.
yeah. And to talk my own book for a second, I think it goes back to our principles for a second, right? Which is that, you know, those companies tend to be companies that are following industry trends and have a bias for action. They're also companies that tend to be very engaged in sort of like truth-seeking behaviors and really understanding the world as it is and not how they want it to be. And so I think, this notion of staying ahead of the curve and that prior question about culture of excellence, I think they're all very interrelated.
Totally. And I'm lucky that the next question I had here ties in well with that, and kind of the tension between innovation, right? Staying ahead of the curve, listening to your customers, building in that direction with what's more important than ever in 2025, which is, operational efficiency.
Mm.
And obviously, as a PE backed company, you have that tension of, how do we think about building for the future with, building a business that we own our own destiny, right? With which I think is a constraint that a lot of companies that were previously VC backed with crazy valuations don't exist anymore because of. So curious to how you think about that tension of mixing innovation with being a long lasting sustainable business.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a bit of a symbiotic relationship, frankly, between innovation and operational efficiency, and you kind of almost can't have one without the other, right? You need innovation to fuel kind of your long-term growth, but you need operational efficiency so that in the end you can fund that innovation, if you will, especially in your context of maybe the money isn't as free flowing as it used to be. And so I think a lot of the question for us is about how you structure operations so that they're streamlining processes that allow you to accelerate innovation. From an Xactly perspective, over the last few years, we've been innovating at the fastest clip that we've ever innovated in our history. We've launched, half a dozen new products and major enhancements just in the last 12 months. And I think a lot of that is because we have been very focused on making sure we're being operationally efficient, for example, in our R&D organization. And that in turn has allowed us to innovate. And we've really thought about this very holistically. So it's everything from rethinking how we manage our product development activities and how we implement, scaled agile, for example. It's, making sure we're staffing teams globally so that we're working effectively around the clock, we're managing time zones. It's leveraging generative AI to improve our efficiency and our productivity. It's, getting really data-driven in our roadmap planning. Like we've done all those things, and one could say, is that operational efficiency? Is that innovation? Right? I would argue that because we made a lot of those blocking and tackling investments in operational efficiency, it has allowed us to innovate much faster, which has allowed us to develop all of these products and these new features, feature and offerings that we have. And we've kind of done that across the business. Like, when I look at our DevOps, for example, our cloud service delivery, we've reduced our cost of service delivery by over 20% while increasing our uptimes. And I would argue that by being operationally efficient, we've become a lot more innovative in how we've delivered our service, right? So I think they're two sides of the same coin in many ways. And I think as companies think about these things, they should be thinking about how do I do things effectively and efficiently, and recognize that will help drive more innovative thinking and will free up capacity to innovate.
Yeah, I love that perspective. I mean, before I was more thinking about it like, oh, how do you spend more money in R&D, and then how do you, think about cutting costs? And but you're right, the forcing function of maybe having less middle management and more people closer to the customer and the product that are actually building it drives innovation, right? Kind of a
Mhm.
forcing function for that. And then going back to the competitive markets, that's also an amazing factor when you think about, who benefits the client, right? You have more
Yeah.
competitors, you have to move faster, you have to be more operationally efficient. And you're probably, like you said, spitting out more innovative products than ever in the last few years because of that.
Yeah, one topical example of that, and I don't want to get into sort of the politics of it, but like with the DeepSeek AI model, like one could argue that they innovated because they were kind of forced to be operationally efficient. Like I don't know all the details about what hardware and stuff they had access to, but that's an example, I think, of a place where people have been able to invent and do things more effectively in more operationally efficient contexts.
Yeah. And to wrap, my question for you is, obviously a larger, more established business versus, us being a high growth startup. How do you think about this general shift in terms of leadership and management to what we felt is more hands-on approach, right? When I'm talking to peers, folks are looking for, that VP that can also, get their hands dirty and be with a smaller team. It just feels like these strategy folks, that used to be kind of more of that professional management, kind of the founder mode vibe of running businesses. It feels like it's really kind of like made its way across, especially the tech world. So I'm curious, as a more
Yeah.
established business, how that's changed your thinking and maybe impacted some of the leadership and management decisions at Xactly.
Yeah. I would say there is no panacea. I don't think founder mode is the answer. I don't think more traditional management is the answer. I think there. I think the thing that's frankly the hardest thing about being a leader is adapting your style to the needs of the moment, right? And I think that requires one to be highly cognizant of like what's happening and be very have insight and intuition around kind of what's needed. And so I would say that it all depends on the situation. I think there are situations where someone, if I can use the term founders mode, needs to be in founders mode. And there are situations where, empowering your teams and delegating and giving them the runway to go make things happen is more appropriate. And frankly, those things could exist at the same time in the same business, but in different functions, right? You may have parts of the business where you need to be diving deep and getting your hands dirty and being much more prescriptive, and there might be parts of the business where you're really trying to cultivate a certain culture or a certain sort of way of doing things, and you want people to sort of find their way there. So I don't take any of these as sort of like gospel, to be honest. I think it's really a function of what is it that's needed in a given function, in a given project, in a given moment of time, and sort of bringing those tools to bear.
Totally. And before we wrap, the last question that I had top of mind, and something I struggle with daily, and I'm sure leaders out there that are listening do, is how do you balance, yourself getting hands on and staying close to customers in the field and the reality of the business in the world, and the fact that you have, a large business to manage, and you need to, be directing and setting the pace and the mission and the vision and, all the other pieces that you're doing. How do you think about balancing those two aspects?
Yeah, I think it's like spinning plates. Like you have to be doing kind of all of it, all the time, if you will. So the way I think about, my job generally is there's like three things I have to do. One is run the business. The second is be individually effective, and the third is manage external relationships, right? And the percentage of time I spend on each one of these things will vary, frankly, based on kind of where the business is, right? I think, in my first year as CEO, I spent a lot more time kind of like running the business and putting some things in place. I suspect moving forward, I'll spend a lot more time managing sort of external relationships and kind of being out there, and conversations like these are great in that regard. And then there's always sort of a challenge of like individual effectiveness for leaders, right? Around where do you spend your time and energy? How do you curate a model that's relevant for the organization? How do you continue to build a perspective that you can use to help guide the team and help them make decisions? Like that's always kind of an ongoing challenge.
Yeah, and when you think about annual planning, setting goals for the year at your level, how do you make sure that you're effectively translating that to folks that need to go out and make those decisions on the field? Maybe that's a good way to wrap in talking about, strategy to execution. How do you make sure
Yeah.
that, you have the thing in the back of your mind, what great looks like, hey, this is what we're going to go out to do. How do you translate that to the hundreds of folks that are going to be, making it happen with customers?
Yeah, I mean, I view that as sort of like a meeting of a top-down set of objectives with a bottoms-up set of plans. And actually, from a sales planning perspective, Xactly has great products that help do that. Shameless plug on my part there. But I think from my perspective, it's being really clear on what are the top-down things that we have to get done. Like, what are the this notion of keeping like the first thing first. Like, what is the key objective that we have? How do we make sure we resource the organization and organize it in a way that it's set up for success, and then really empowering the teams to come up with the very tactical sort of like execution plans that ladder up to allow us to hit those objectives, and then providing guidance and feedback on those plans to make sure that they truly are aligned and there isn't sort of an air gap between the bottoms up and the tops down way of looking at the world.
Totally. Yeah, I think what I see most common is sometimes, not implying this is you, but sometimes leaders have this, great theory of, hey, this is how we're going to do, open this new channel this year, launch this new product. And it feels very far from, and kind of alienating for the folks that need to go out and do it. It doesn't feel realistic or done in the wrong way. So I think that's something that we constantly hear, again, from kind of the CRO. Hey, you haven't been selling for, X number of years or decades, and you're 4 or 5 levels removed from the field. How do we make sure that we're translating your ideas of what great looks like down to the reality? But, I loved your first point of, hunting for the truth, and keeping those principles, top of mind to drive excellence and, to not be too far from what reality is, right?
Yeah. Great.
Awesome. Any closing thoughts or advice that maybe you'd give yourself starting out on your leadership journey to leave with the community here?
I mean, I think we've covered a bunch of it. I mean, I think at the end of the day, with leaders, there's one thing I'd say is like it's more important to have the questions than it is to have the answers. And so as people, I think as people come up in organizations, they sort of get graded on having the answers and getting the thing done. And I think when you transition into a leadership role, suddenly like you're not the one who has to always have the answers, nor is it your job to have the answers, but it's your job to know what questions to ask in order to guide the team to the place where they need to be. And so making that transition needs to be a really intentional process. And so that's the one sort of coaching I give a lot of our sort of like first line managers or people who are starting to run larger organizations at Xactly as they think about how to be effective in their jobs.
Yeah, you go from, maybe to tie it back to the theme, you go from you executing and being the person to deliver excellence to how do you kind of build a culture around that, right? How do you have people kind of reflect on that themselves and kind of be a force multiplier there? So, no, this was awesome. I appreciate you taking some time out of the busy day to share your thoughts here and, talk about ways that you've been able to drive excellence across your organizations.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you for having me, Ross. I really appreciate it. Congrats on all the success with the Accord. We're really excited to be partners with you all and looking forward to doing great things together in the coming years.